Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Diane Keaton helps Brendan Gleeson's recluse fight to keep his home in Hampstead. Widow charity shop worker Emily, played by Diane Keaton, is unhappy with her life as she lives in her apartment in London that overlooks Hampstead Heath, dealing with snobby neighbours and debts that her philandering husband left behind. One day, while looking out of her window, she spies Donald Horner, played by Brendan Gleeson, a hermit who has made his home in a shack on the heath, living off the land by himself, and becomes fascinated by him. When developers threaten Donald's hut, Emily forms an unusual relationship with Donald as she helps him take him to court to fight for his little piece of land. Hampstead is very loosely based on the true story of Harry Hallowes, or Harry the Hermit as he was known to residents of the Heath, where he made his home in a makeshift hut after being evicted from his flat in 1987, and supported himself with a series of odd jobs, including for filmmaker Terry Gilliam, who lived in the area at one point. In 2007, Hallowes made the headlines when he took developers that were planning to evict him to court to successfully claim squatters' rights to the land he'd been living on, and thus he became a millionaire overnight because the land was estimated as being worth £2 million. Despite success, however, Hallowes was very much a man that kept to himself, but you can understand why Hollywood wanted to make a film about his story, because it's a perfect feel-good David versus Goliath tale. Hallowes, however, was decidedly less enamoured with the idea, saying in an interview before his death in 2016, "I don't want anything to do with it. I never wanted anything to do with it." So this poses a bit of a quandary for the filmmakers. How do you tell this story without actually using the man it's about and make it accessible to a wider audience? And apparently someone got the bizarre idea, let's turn it into a rom-com! Thus we have our fictionalised American protagonist Emily, played by Diane Keaton. She's a charity shop worker, Oxfam in case you're wondering, and she's also a widow. Her husband has died a year before the events of the film, and in some ways she's still coming to terms with that. She's still living in the Hampstead apartment that they lived in together, and the cracks are beginning to show. Literally, because the first thing we see Diane Keaton do in this movie is position a bucket under a leak in the roof. And of course all the revelations about her husband's affair have come out, so she's not really feeling particularly sad about his death, but she's sort of in this place where she doesn't really feel herself. She very much feels like an outsider inside this apartment complex, especially because the neighbours are very stuck up and very pompous, and she doesn't really agree with them in a lot of ways. She tries to socialise with them, but when they try to foist their causes upon her, in particular they're trying to petition against a mobile phone mast being placed up because they think it will threaten the house prices in the area, she's not really interested in that. That's not really her concern. She's the typical Diane Keaton character where she's a little bit kooky and eccentric, and it stands in very stark contrast to how stuck up a lot of the neighbours are that she lives with, and so she doesn't really feel at home in the place that she lives in. And this is a bit of a theme in the movie, in that the places that we live in are very much representative of our personalities and our lives, and they very much are shaped by our experiences and what we bring to them. That's what we bring to those spaces. And so with all this going on, Emily starts looking through her possessions in her loft, and she picks up a pair of binoculars and looks through them out the window and spies Donald, who is the film's analogue of Harry Hallowes, played by Brendan Gleeson, who, like the real-life inspiration, is also Irish and keeps his accent. And of course, because Emily is quirky and eccentric, she finds herself drawn towards him, and she starts watching him from afar at first, and this is how their first interactions sort of play out. At one point, Donald gets attacked by a group of people, and that's sort of Emily's first direct interaction, is that she calls the police and an ambulance for him because she witnesses the attack, which is a bit of a strange way of starting this romance. And this friendship sort of develops over the first act of the film, and it's interesting because you can very clearly tell they've romanticised the story to a great extent. The most obvious sign of this being the actual design of the shack that Donald lives in, because it's pretty much a little mini cottage. if you looked at the photos of the real-life Harry Hallowes, you would have seen where he lived, which is not especially glamorous. It's just a very basic shelter, really. It's pretty much just this little hidey hole for him to tuck away in. Whereas here, it's a full-blown little mini house. It even has a little oven that is used as a makeshift fireplace. This in itself seems like it's very mildly inspired by the fact that that Hallowes in real life, he used to collect sort of electronics and things like old fridges, and that would surround the hut where he lived. That seems like where that's come from, and that becomes a major plot point in the movie. This shack is it's quite comfortable in its own way. It's very much a little nook onto itself, and seems very much aimed towards the genteel audience that this movie is very much geared at. And so you can very much see that they've cleaned up this story a lot, because they're trying to make him a viable romantic lead, but it doesn't really feel especially plausible. It just feels like, ooh, this is very nice. It's got a little bit of shabby chic to it going on. Now, don't get me wrong, Diane Keaton and Brendan Gleeson are great performers in their own right. I think they're quite entertaining actors, especially Gleeson. I think he's a superb performer, but I wouldn't say that they had great chemistry together. Although, granted, it's very hard to get chemistry on a romantic level when one of your leads smells like a pond. Literally smells like a pond, because he actually bathes in it. At one point, they're fixing up the shack, and him and the person that he's fixing it up with both dive into the pond under the arguments of, oh man, we're really sweaty and stinky, let's go freshen up. In the duck poo? Really? Gross. That's... ew. That's not going to make you any cleaner at all. And generally, it feels like the dynamic between these two just isn't plausible on a sort of romantic relationship level. Friends, I can believe. Love, not quite so much, really. And I don't think it helps that, in terms of Gleeson's performance, he's probably a little bit too good at playing this sort of loner figure, in that Donald, if you push him too much, he sort of spikes up like an emotional porcupine, as Emily puts it, rather amusingly, one of the few quite funny lines in this film. And he generally doesn't quite like this idea of being turned into Emily's project, in that she tries to sort of help him out and rally the community together to try and, you know, aid his case and help him stay on his land. And he doesn't really like that idea. He just wants to be left alone, and that's a bit like Hallowes, but the fact that he throws these big temper tantrums at certain points, again, makes him a little bit off-putting as a love interest. And so, as a romance, the movie doesn't really succeed on that level, and I think it really backfires on the movie in a lot of ways, because I don't think that should be the focus of the movie, and it only makes it more glaring that this doesn't work. This idea has gone tremendously wrong. It's very ill-conceived. They really shouldn't have gone in this direction with this story. And they try to bring the characters together in that it later transpires that Donald has a tragic backstory, and beneath that hard exterior, he's a damaged romantic at heart, in that he had someone that he loved, and this shack that he builds is very much sort of meant to be his manifestations of guilt and grief, and why he's decided to excise himself from society. And on that level, they try to link him with Emily, but even with that connection, I still don't absolutely buy it, and that sort of backstory feels very much like a cliche, unfortunately. I was predicting that they were going to try and make him sympathetic using that sort of tactic. And I keep bringing up this theme of homes being what we make of them, but I think that's just me stretching to find any kind of substance in this wafer-thin flick. And once you realise that the two leads aren't sparking together the way they really should do, I think that exposes just how hollow and empty the film is at its core. It's meant to be this very quaint, very mild-mannered, even charming little tale, but really, I spent a lot of Hampstead being dreadfully bored by it. And if the romance side of it doesn't work, then the comedy might actually be even worse, because so much of it seems like scenes from a contrived sitcom. There's a moment where Emily brings Donald back to her apartment to freshen up, have the bath that he's not really had for a very long time, and her son just happens to pop by at that precise moment, and he's played by James Norton, who is utterly pointless. He's sort of prodding her about the fact that she's in better spirits, and then suddenly out pops Donald wearing a face mask and a towel over his head and cucumbers in his eyes, and he's dancing doo 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 doo, and he flicks the cucumbers out of his eyes. It's groan-worthy. But by far the worst comedic element of the film is Jason Watkins. Jason Watkins is a quite likeable British character actor, but here, director Joel Hopkins, who previously helmed Last Chance Harvey, and he also did that really awful farce, The Love Punch, which explains the comedy stylings here, he appears to give Watkins just full reign over this character. He's playing a suitor of Emily's in that she's sort of forced to go on this date with him. He's not very subtle in his advances, to put it mildly. He's an accountant, and he's doing these dates ostensibly to try and help her out with a situation, as it were, but really he's got amorous designs on her, and he's really creepy. He's touching her inappropriately and invading her space and showing up unannounced, and it's not funny. It's really uncomfortable. It's almost a grotesque kind of character, because it's so big and it's so broad, it really doesn't fit with the rest of the movie, which is so low-key, it virtually flops off the screen, whereas Watkins is just chewing through all the scenery. He really desperately needs to be reined in. But what really sinks Hampstead is that it doesn't believe in the principles that it claims to. It's meant to be telling this story of a hermit fighting for his home, for his right to live, to exist. And you can very easily see this in different hands as being a big, rousing, crowd-pleasing story. And the movie totally squanders it. It feels like an afterthought, because so much of it is based around the romance between Keaton and Gleeson, just wandering around Hampstead Heath and having meet-cutes in graveyards. The focus of the movie is totally wrong. And so the movie doesn't really address the actual story that it's trying to tell in a particularly interesting way. It's just sort of thrown into the third act, and I'm not saying that it should have all become a courtroom drama or anything like that, but at least have a bit of enthusiasm for what you're trying to say. And I don't think this movie is trying to say anything. It's that empty of a movie. It's that much of a vacant shell that they've stripped so much personality of in trying to make it accessible. And as such, I think even the filmmakers have realised that their film isn't really about anything. Because at the beginning and end of the movie, you hear these news reports of affordable housing, and clearly the idea is that we're meant to sort of connect Donald's plight with those, struggling to have affordable housing, which is a big issue in our times. You know what? I might have believed the filmmakers were really interested in this subject if they didn't literally radio them in. These scenes feel like they're... not even scenes. These pieces of audio feel like they're bolted onto the film to try and, again, give it some substance that the actual script that they're filming was desperately lacking. And just to show how much the movie has gone very, very wrong, by far the most interesting portion of it is the courtroom section, and that's maybe about 15-20 minutes of the running time. It's in that particular portion of the movie does it actually briefly come to life and become the movie that it should have been to a certain extent. And also because there's also some additional supporting roles. There's a small role for Simon Callow as a judge, but also Phil Davis plays a very small pivotal role, and he steals probably the 2-3 minutes that he's on screen. But what really makes clear just how bad and utterly misconceived this film is its final 20 minutes. Oh, you thought the courtroom battle was the finale? You thought this story had a natural end point? Well, instead, the filmmakers decide to massively overstay their welcome with an epilogue that suddenly shifts in direction in a way that tramples over the entire film before it. The movie ends with a dedication to the real-life Harry Hallowes, claiming that he was a man that lived the way that he wanted to. If that was what I was supposed to take away from this movie, then the ending totally undoes that. No, it steamrolls it. It turns the movie into something totally pointless. It really does. And in the process, it manages to completely underserve the audience who has sat through to this point, the story that it's trying to tell, and the very man it's supposedly in tribute to. But it's emblematic of a movie that has no idea what it really wants to say about the subject matter or even the story that it's trying to tell. And I can't even recommend Hampstead as something you'd watch on a rainy afternoon with a cup of tea, because quite frankly, it doesn't succeed at being crowd pleasing, it doesn't work as romance, and it sure doesn't work as comedy. It's just a straight up failure, unfortunately, and a real puzzling mess of a film. Hampstead is a strange little movie that tries to loosely tell a true story of a hermit fighting for his home and turn it into a rom-com, and the combination simply doesn't work. Diane Keaton and Brendan Gleeson are engaging performers as always, but even they can't breathe life into this flimsy confection because their strange romance never really convinces. As a comedy, the gags are often forced and irritating, especially from an overplaying Jason Watkins, and it's barely even a courtroom drama, hardly exerting any enthusiasm for Gleeson's cause to be triumphant or crowd-pleasing. It's so mild that Hampstead's true badness might slip you by until its final section, where the movie suddenly betrays its entire premise and its own real-life inspiration, confirming how pointless this utterly inert flick is. If you like this review, you can make yourself at home at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other benefits. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. Some days